Welcome to the Just Race podcast. I'm your host, Joe Sweeney, and today on the show, we are diving back into biotech. Founded by a former Google X engineer who worked on wild moonshot projects at Google, Culture Bio is building the infrastructure for the next revolution in biology. If you listen to this show often, you know that biotech is booming, or if you work in venture capital or just pay attention to the stock market, Culture Bio is building the tools to make it easier for startups and small businesses to launch in this space. And if synthetic biology has all the promise that we hope it does, it may be bigger than AWS one day. Our guest is Will Patrick, founder and CEO of Culture Bio. Besides Google X, Will worked at the MIT Media Lab prior to starting Culture, which is actually how we got connected through prior guest Habib Haddad, partner at E14 who invests in companies spinning out of the MIT Media Lab. Will has raised an enormous $100 million for Culture so far. I hope you enjoy this dive into the booming biotech industry with Will Patrick. Well, to dive right in, Will, you have a fascinating background having worked at Google X and the MIT Media Lab before starting this company and raising over $100 million for Culture Biosciences. Can you give us a little bit of an introduction on who you are and what Culture Bio is building?
Well, first of all, just thanks for having me. It's really fun to tell my story and talk more about Culture Biosciences. I did that after school at Google, but most of the time there I was at Google X. It was sort of like the early days. So there was probably like 50 or 100 people. And the only projects when I started there were the self-driving car project and the Google Glass. So I was a part of this like little team of people that was in charge of like trying to come up with new project ideas, which is cool. It was very fortuitous because I was super young. Everyone else I was working with was like way smarter, way more experienced than me. I was just sort of the young kid on the team trying to be helpful. And it was a really valuable experience. I ended up sort of being involved at the early stage in two different projects, Wing and Loon, of which of those two I worked mostly on Wing, and I was like the first person to work on Wing. And Wing is still around about 10 years later. It's a drone delivery program.
Yeah, so Google X is fascinating. It's like Google's essentially special projects division, and it's really interesting because the only things you guys work on are things that can really move the needle for Google. So they have to be like kind of projects with a massive potential reach. So Loon, I know, is Wi-Fi balloons, like balloons in the high atmosphere, the stratosphere that push down Wi-Fi across the globe. Which would get more people on Google, of course. And then the other one, Wing, I'm not as familiar with.
Yeah, Wing is a drone delivery program. So, there's a bunch of these companies now doing drone delivery. And there's some cool startups, like Zipline is probably the most prominent, Matternet's another, there's a bunch of others. But I think Amazon was the first one who made a public announcement about drone delivery, which was, I can't remember when that was, like maybe 2013, 2014. Yeah, we started working on it in earnest. I think it was like 2012. And it was sort of a crazy idea at the time. No one had, aside from like science fiction or anything like that, no one had talked about the idea of drone delivery. But we started, the first challenge of that project, there were two big challenges initially. One was what to deliver and why. So like, what's the advantage of delivering with drones? Why would you want to do that? Where in like what types of places might be a good fit for drone delivery, and then sort of like what are you going to deliver? So what are the types of things you'd want to deliver more quickly with a drone versus using some other type of delivery system? And then the other big challenge was like actually literally how do you deliver things to the ground? So you have this drone, you can move it fast through the air, but how do you get a package like into the hands of somebody? So those are some of the challenges I worked on at the time. But yeah, I think that you know, for me and like my trajectory, the more important thing that actually happened while I was at Google X is, I just collaborated with a few folks there who had more of a biosciences background. And they just sort of just from like the conversations and reading a few papers with them, I got sort of hooked on sort of using biology as a manufacturing medium, I guess you could say. The first thing I remember reading, I think it was in like 2012, was from a friend of mine who was a colleague there, Adrian. He was sending me these papers on DNA nanotechnology. So this is you basically engineer DNA strands to self-assemble into structures. And I found that to be one of the more fascinating things I had sort of read as a sort of a young sort of engineer. Just the idea of self-assembly of structures is something that had always fascinated me, and then being able to like repurpose DNA to do that was so interesting and fascinating. And that was sort of like a gateway for me to being interested in biology, interested in bioengineering, thinking about, how can biology be a tool to build things. So that sort of is what triggered my interest in the area and eventually led me to go back to grad school at the Media Lab. And I would say the other big thing about Google X, since we're on that topic, is just, it was a fascinating experience to see how to evaluate ideas, how to think through the development of ideas. And so there was many learnings there that were very applicable to the experience of starting a company and the experience of going through this sort of idea maze at the beginning of it. And then also particularly for like a deep tech company where you're sort of thinking about how do we develop this really complicated thing, and so had a little bit of experience seeing that, at least from the Google X experience, that helped translate that to building it. My experience in the startup setting.
Yeah, I mean, Google X is effectively an accelerator for the wildest deep tech ideas in the world. So I imagine it's a great way to learn how to validate an idea. The other major question I have for you then, though, is if you weren't initially in biology, what's your actual background from like a scientific perspective?
Honestly, it's like pretty limited. I went to grad school at the Media Lab. I was at the MIT Media Lab, which is this like sort of interdisciplinary organization. And I focused on sort of building. It was a really amazing group. It was Neri Oxman's group. And Neri is focused on sort of biology-based design and manufacturing and architecture. So using biology as both inspiration for development of products and architecture, as well as a medium itself. So we were doing all sorts of things, from using biological-based materials in architecture to embedding designed organisms into products and architecture to give it sort of new functionality. So it was very sort of speculative work. And yeah, it was amazing. But more than anything, it was designing, building, fabricating, making things versus like any type of real sort of like scientific background. I would say my background is just generally leading up to this company as someone who's, build sort of engineering and design of new systems. That's sort of more of my core competency, sort of coming into starting the company versus like deep scientific expertise.
So I think that's a good segue into what are you actually building at Culture Bio?
Yeah, so we're building infrastructure for biomanufacturing. So the actual hardware and operations needed to develop manufacturing processes and scale them up. So we can unpack all of that for the rest of the time, but that involves lots of custom hardware and technology, like physical stuff that we build to run the infrastructure. It also involves software that our team uses to run it all, as well as a lot of software that our clients use. So from like a product or a customer perspective, basically our customers are these biotech companies that are developing a new product that is manufactured using biology. And what we offer them is, instead of having to build out all of this infrastructure themselves, and that involves physically buying a lot of stuff, hiring a lot of folks, building out the software and data infrastructure. We sort of offer all that to them as a subscription business model. So we've started at the research and development phase where you are developing a new manufacturing process. And, over time, we're building larger and larger scale versions of our infrastructure. And so the end vision for Culture is to be a set of infrastructure that you can use to develop a manufacturing process and scale it up and actually do your commercial manufacturing in our infrastructure. And just so, I know the podcast has a very broad sort of audience. So, maybe is worth pausing and just like, what is biomanufacturing for a second?
That's probably useful. Yeah.
Yeah. So just basically this is engineering an organism to produce something. So more than half of new therapeutic drugs are made this way. So, generally in biopharmaceuticals, you might engineer a mammalian cell. And then it's producing probably a protein that is then acting as the therapeutic. But there's tons of non-pharmaceutical applications as well. One of the most well-known examples today is Impossible Foods, which makes the heme protein, which goes in their burger in a fermentation process. So the heme, like hemoglobin, it's what makes the Impossible Burger like bloody and like gives it the red color, gives it a lot of flavor. And
it's the same protein that's actually found in cow muscle, essentially.
It's very similar. They actually, I believe, use a protein that is in, interestingly, I think a legume, but for whatever reason, it gives really good flavor that is representative of like beef. So, but there's a lot of other examples of these, you might call them alt proteins. Mm-hmm. These proteins that are typically derived from an animal source that are now being made through a microbial source where you're genetically modifying a yeast organism typically, or it could be a bacteria, to produce that protein. So there's lots of other applications as well, even past food, like materials, just fine chemicals, lots of applications in agriculture. So ultimately, with all of these different verticals and end applications, one of the biggest, if not the biggest challenge for all of the companies is scaling up their manufacturing. It's become much, much easier to design an organism that can like produce the heme protein. It is very hard to scale up the manufacturing of that and actually make it economical and produce it at scale. And that's sort of the main thing that like holds back the industry is that problem. And so, we're sort of trying to create solutions to the things that are typically bottlenecking most companies and making it really costly and time consuming to scale up these manufacturing processes.
So I was looking for an example of of a company that's using this that might be suitable. And I just had Sri Kosari on the show, and he's the founder of Octant Bio, which is doing something similar, making mammalian cells, human cells, and then testing them with different drugs. But I think an even better example is one of the first companies I've had on the show is this company Helena, which is making human proteins for infant formula. And they aim to make it more like actual breast milk. And it was fascinating because towards the end of the conversation, we talked about how one of the major bottlenecks is actually scaling, because she calls it precision culturing, making these different proteins with bacteria. But going from like a lab where you can make a small amount to making a product that goes on the shelves in, every Walmart in the country is a pretty big jump. And it sounds like that's exactly what you're doing, is you're coming in with this essentially business model innovation, these scaled up bioreactors all over the US or wherever people need them. And then you could essentially be the next step in the scaling process for a company like Helena.
That's right. I mean, there's so much potential for Helena and the Helenas of the world to just have such a great impact on problems like that. And the true thing that's holding it back is the difficulty of scaling manufacturing. And you constantly hear this over and over and over again from anyone in the field. So, there's a lot of problems that, we need to solve. And definitely that's why we started Culture, was to work on solving them. So, yeah. I think it's really inspiring to see, companies like them, other companies like working on those really big problems, and we got to build good tools so that they can actually solve them.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because it's both like kind of a business model innovation in that like these are distributed and scalable, but at the same time, I think Habib compared you to TSMC because like building silicon chips, there just aren't a lot of people who can build silicon chips like TSMC. I mean, no
Yeah.
one really. And like you, I mean, I don't think there are a lot of other startups or big biotech companies that can do large scale precision culturing. Is that right? Do you think that's one of the edge that you have?
Yeah, there's several different elements to this. So the first thing is, um, I would say there is, again, there's a lot of nuance here in terms of these different industry verticals. So, but maybe to make it a little bit easier, we'll just focus on the non-biopharma world for a second. So the Helenas of the world, the Impossible Foods world. We can also talk about biopharma as well. But yes, within the sort of non-pharmaceutical space, you're totally right that part of what we're doing is really a business model innovation, where we're going from the industry is typically vertically integrated, where you have the big companies. Let's just use an example like Novozymes, which is a maker of enzymes that are in like Tide and all sorts of different, products. You've never heard of them, but they're like behind a lot of what makes consumer products really good. So like Novozymes is vertically integrated. They have all of their own development. They have all their own manufacturing. They do it all themselves. Another company like DSM would be another good example. There's many other examples of companies like that. So it's vertically integrated business. And what we're sort of trying to do is take a part of that vertically integrated company and say, hey, like there's a lot of these pieces of the value chain that don't need to be built out every single time in every single company. And like, let's get really, really good at them and do them at Culture. And then we can provide a horizontal sort of tool set that all of the product companies can then leverage. So this is a very common thing that's happened in other industries. A famous one would be obviously semiconductor, where this transition from vertical to horizontal integrated, supply chains happened in the sort of 90s and 2000s. But like, the personal computing industry did the same thing, in more like the 80s, 90s timeframe. So it just makes a lot of sense for lots of reasons that we should see this type of, more horizontal sets of tool providers within the, biomanufacturing space. So then there's a couple, so to be successful in doing that, there's some classic things you have to start doing well. So one of them is if we are providing biomanufacturing as a service or like this set of tools, right, to enable the product companies, one thing you have to do is you have to make the input output really effective. So, just quite simply said, the Helenas of the world need to be able to say like, hey, Culture, this is what I want you to do for me. And then we have to be like, great, this is what we're going to do for you. And we're going to give you back some product. And that can actually be an incredibly hard thing to do effectively in our world because there's an incredible amount of complexity to these biomanufacturing processes. The jargon term in our space is called technology transfer. But, this is almost like the opposite of doing like 3D printing, where you just have a simple STL file, you send it to a 3D printer and it like the same thing prints. This is the opposite of that, where you have hundreds of pages of documentation. You have to get it, if you're working with a different manufacturer in a different location, you might have to translate it to a different language. It's a very complex sort of in and out problem. So one of the things that we do in terms of enabling our solution is building software that is sort of an interface between us and the customer that manages sort of all of the logistics and transfer of that information. The other thing that we think is super important for this business model to work is you have to create a customer experience where it's as if it was in their own lab, because we're sort of like a core part of their research and development. They're using the data that we're generating and the results that we're generating in real time in order to do their work. So we have to create sort of a whole software experience for them to do that. So that's another innovation that we have, which is we have like real-time access in the cloud to our physical infrastructure. And so that was another thing we had to build and sort of innovate on to enable this business model. The next thing, that we had to do is we knew that if they're just by doing, modeling early on and starting the business, we saw some big challenges if we were to try and run our business by relying on the typical equipment providers that are out there. So like the capital assets that go into our infrastructure, we saw that, okay, if we were just buying what's off the shelf, because of the cost of it, the set of features, and the supply chain timelines, there was actually, our business models not going to really work. So we saw an opportunity to build out our own infrastructure where, first of all, it can enable the solutions. We could build features that were, better than the specifications of what was out there as well. And also from a capital cost perspective, it was going to be a lot lower. We're going to be able to save a lot of capital and then also control our own supply chain. So this is sort of similar to how, at Google or Amazon, they actually build their own servers, right? And they build their own server racks and data centers, and they design all that themselves because, they versus relying on the third-party providers. And so they become more, as they've become a cloud computing provider, they've become more integrated in their tech stack internally to build out all the hardware and software themselves to create the best sort of cloud experience. It's sort of similar for us where we're building out all of our own bioreactor infrastructure ourselves to have sort of the best, cloud bioreactor experience for our customers. So that's another really huge, core technical innovation. And so we do that. We did that first on the small scale, and then we're, with these bench scale bioreactors, as they would be called, and now we're doing that building out these larger scale ones too.
It's like you're building dev tools in a sense for software, in that the key thing with dev tools is it's all about outsourcing. So Twilio makes a really good product for sending your customers text messages. Amazon, AWS, you don't have to build your own server room. Stripe, taking payments. And then software developers, one of the reasons we've had this explosion in software is they just plug and play whatever services they need.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating because it feels like a lot of those companies are being built in biotech right now. Do you think that's right, looking at the market from your perspective, building in it?
Yeah, I think that's exactly a good framing as like a dev tools. And like, if you think like my co-founder, Matt, we go back all the way to college. We're really good friends. We're both engineers, and we're both like people who loved really great tools, right? Like, as I'm more of a hardware engineer myself, like I loved companies like Proto Labs, which you can get really quick CNC machine parts, and they've built out a really, really good tool stack for doing that. Matt's more of a software engineer, so using like Twilio, for example, or using, AWS or GCP, those tool stacks. So when we looked at biomanufacturing, there's just nothing like that at all. And so we saw like if we could create these really good stacks of tools for companies, it would just really enable the rest of the industry. And then it's just also an opportunity because it seems like, just from our perspective, the tools available to these companies that are manufacturing their bioproducts were just really poor. And we just saw lots of opportunities to really differentiate it with good tools. So I think that's a good analogy.
And then on the actually developing your own reactors, that's really interesting because the huge capex for any of these companies is obviously a major hurdle. It's one of the things that makes deep tech so hard. And the fact that you went in and, after starting the company, looked at all the tech that you were going to have to buy and realized your business model didn't work is wild. Do you actually build like the hardware yourselves with manufacturing overseas, bring it in, and then, build the whole thing from scratch yourself at this point?
Yeah, that's most of our core infrastructure we build ourselves. I mean, it's pretty crazy if you think about how full stack we are. We build our own hardware infrastructure. We write our own software, like web application, and then we operate it all. Like it's pretty wild. And so we had to, the other thing that's crazy, in retrospect, is we did all of that, and we had our first product within like 9 months of prototyping. We were working with beta customers, and very, very like MVP. But we decided to like do this very much launch and iterate approach. So since the company was like about 15 months old, we've had customers and been generating revenue, and then we've been like sort of building the plane as it flies. So that's been a pretty crazy experience, actually.
So do you send out emails to your customers like, we just built a new bioreactor, so this feature is now online, like a software product?
Yeah, exactly. Stuff like that all the time.
That's super cool. And
Yeah.
I keep comparing you to things, but this really reminds me of SpaceX in that when Elon went to start SpaceX, the initial team just wanted to build the capsule that went on top of the rocket. And they went to buy from contractors at NASA. And, every single contractor, they were like, this is way too expensive because they were selling it to NASA and the government. And now, pretty much like steel and copper wire rolls in one side and rockets roll out the other with the software and everything built on top.
Yeah. That's definitely what we aspire to, is have it that full stack. I see lots of opportunities to do so. And again, it's for that reason, like SpaceX is, that's sort of almost their core innovation, right? It's just like, we're building it all ourselves. And then of course, like the reusable rockets, et cetera. But like the way they build their equipment is totally different than, any other company. And it gives them all these advantages. We sort of saw something similar. I really would say, like, when we started the company, we built like a very simple, like, financial operating model of our core business. And we're like, let's look at all the numbers as best as we can. If we were plugging in what we got off the shelf, and then where can we innovate, right? So that's always been core to our technical development, technical road mapping, thinking about the competitive advantage, is like, actually, what is the operating model here? What would it be for our customer? What would it be with another service provider if you were reliant on just like totally off the shelf, and you didn't do any technical innovation? And then where do we innovate technically, and what advantage does that give us in the operating model? Like, that's always been sort of core to what we do, and how to think about it. I bet, like, for example, companies that I always think about, like, what are like good analogous companies to us? And, one type would be like the vertical farming companies. I imagine they go through a very similar sort of process where, like, okay, we have to compete with farming, and so therefore we're going to build this model for what does it mean to build like basically a vertical factory for farming. And, we could do these technical innovations. They could give us these advantages. Here's the CapEx cost. Here's what it's going to cost to operate the vertical farm, and so much of their research and development probably is with that lens. And it's very similar for us as well. So
it feels like in part this is a bet on bioreactors, precision culturing being used more and more over time, which, given it's a brand new technology, seems like it very much will be. But what does demand look like from customers right now? Like, how big is this market? And then beyond that, what have customers been saying about your product?
If you think about the total, the total amount of, let's start with product sales, like, so super top down when you think about like market size. If we think about like the product sales of products made through biomanufacturing, in biopharma, it's like hundreds of billions. In non-pharma, it's also, in hundreds of billions. It's actually these huge markets of products are produced through biotechnology. If you think about the amount of money spent in the actual manufacturing of those products, it's tens of billions to maybe $100 billion in the manufacturing. And then in the research and development of the manufacturing processes, it's more in the sort of like small tens of billions. So it's still a pretty large market if we're just thinking about helping our customers develop their manufacturing processes. And the market size there is like how much money is literally spent by all the companies in the world to develop their biomanufacturing processes. So it's like all the capital equipment, all of the people that are operating the capital equipment, all the scientist time, all of your software, like all the facilities costs, whatever, like all of that stuff. that's sort of our market that we're going after. Because when we work with customers, like they're thinking about us like, hey, I could build this out myself, and therefore I'm going to have these line items on my like balance sheet and my operating costs. So, or I go work with Culture, and so that's how like their CFO is thinking about working with us, right? And so those are the line items that we would be replacing. What's interesting is like our ACV tends to be pretty high as a result because, a typical bioreactor, like just one simple bench scale bioreactor, if you buy it new, is like 80 grand. It's so insane how expensive they are. So, a small startup, if they wanted to buy, like, if they needed a suite of these small scale bioreactors to do their work, they might need to buy, 6 to 12 of those. So you're talking about hundreds of thousands of CapEx spend, up to $1 million in CapEx spend for like a really small startup company. Like we're talking about Series A stage. So it's a very, very high spend for them. And then you have to hire, multiple operational staff to run these things. So the cost associated with this part of the business is really high for these. And so it means that for us, our contract sizes are always in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for customers per year, if not in the millions. And we even, we'll work with, Series A stage companies. So this is a big amount of spend for all of our customers, and we'll even be engaging with these early stage companies. They're spending a big chunk of capital, big chunk of their money with us. So I would say, presently we have 20 to 30 to 40, somewhere in that customer range. Can't remember the exact number right now. We have more customers right now than we can serve, actually. So we're currently like having to increase our contract minimums a little bit. We have so much interest. That is mostly driven by just the surge of the biotechnology sector overall, to your point earlier, and the needs for the work that we do. I think it's also driven a little bit by this virtualization of work. We can be helpful there, where a scientist can be based anywhere, log onto their website and be doing their actual data collection with Culture. So that, just the move towards, virtualized work, I think also people see, oh, it'd be super great to work with Culture because it would enable us to do that. The biggest challenge for us right now is scaling all the hardware, scaling the software, scaling our teams. So, that's what 2022 is all about at Culture Biosciences, is like we've got really great progress with our current customers, and we just need to scale everything so we can continue to allow our customers to expand, bring on new customers, et cetera.
Yeah, this idea of abstracting the physical into the cloud is one I'm like, I absolutely love, because there are all types of companies that do it. One of the founders I had on a little while back wasn't even that company that we talked about, but he built Lob, which is an API to send mail different places. There are manufacturing companies like Hadrian that are focused on this, but kind of what you're doing, but for like aircraft parts. And it's amazing that it's happening in science now. Josh Wolf at Lux Capital talked a little bit about that, how like scientists can now work on science from anywhere in the world and use your services to do it at scale.
Yeah, that's definitely sort of, I think, long-term, a big trend in sort of biotechnology, is that sort of virtualization of the lab, enabling scientists to do their work from anywhere.
As we start to talk about this whole market in general, beyond just Culture Bio, I'm curious, what are the other kind of technologies and business models in biotech that you really admire right now?
One that I have my eye on, as does everyone in the industry, is Ginkgo Bioworks.
Yeah.
They, in many ways, are right next to us in the value chain. So Ginkgo is the organism design company. So they are some of the world's experts, leading experts in being able to engineer a new organism to produce something. And they do that as sort of a service for their clients. And so, we're sort of a little bit right next stage in the process where we're helping manufacture. You actually have that organism now that's producing something. And they have this business model that is a little bit different than ours. That is based on you have some upfront fees, but that's mostly to cover costs, and then they have like a royalty or like an equity ownership of the company if it's a startup, for example. Yeah, I'm really interested and intrigued to see how they do. They just recently went public with a SPAC, several months back. That was a very, very successful offering. And so, yeah, I'm really interested to see how they continue to develop, how the public markets receive them over time. I think they're really great. I think I really, I know a lot of the folks there, and I think there's wonderful, and I think they have a great culture. And generally, the mission of their company is very aligned with Culture's mission as well, in order to develop these tools to enable the rest of the sector. So they're obviously one that we have our eye on a lot, and really curious to see how things go.
I'm a big fan of Ginkgo and have been since I worked in Boston, and my undergrad was biomedical engineering. So like that, the kind of core of their pitch is like the heart of synthetic biology, being able to make super complex things out of, grown out of plants or bacteria. I'd love to dive into a little bit of what the difference is between Culture Bio and Ginkgo Bio, as I think it sounds like Ginkgo Bio actually engineers a new bacteria or little microscopic organism that will make a protein, for instance. And then what Culture does is Culture takes your, new bacteria and scales it up and makes that protein at scale.
Yeah, that's a fairly good assessment. Yeah, we're sort of like right next to each other. But what's cool is we're both these sort of like, again, it's sort of like breaking that vertical company into horizontal parts. Ginkgo is sort of the organism design part of the company that you would utilize, and we're then sort of the manufacturing development and scale up part of the company. So they're right next to each other. But yeah, the way your synopsis was right on.
Yeah, it sounds like you almost take on a little less product risk in that you aren't building the new organism from scratch. You're taking something that works and scaling it into like an industrial scale process.
Yeah. The other thing that's different is like our current business model is more of a subscription business model. And so there's no royalty for using Culture. So we always really liked that because it meant we were super neutral for each customer. Like we're not picking a favorite, and we're not going to try and get a royalty with them, right? Because like there's a lot of different companies in the space working on similar products. We just wanted to be like a neutral tool set. So that's one also like business model difference between the two companies. But yeah, I think one thing that is really nice for us is we don't have a lot of risk for, like, let's say certain verticals or products if they fail. Like maybe it turns out that like alternative food proteins aren't the big thing that we're all expecting it to. That would be a bummer for lots of reasons, but from a Culture Biosciences perspective, we're more diversified in terms of the customers we work with. I would say Ginkgo probably would be similar though. I don't obviously have any inside knowledge of Ginkgo, but from their public information, they seem to be working in biopharma and in food proteins and all sorts of different stuff. So they also seem pretty diversified. One additional thing I'll say there that I recently read, I can't remember when it was, 6 months ago, 9 months ago. I was reading about the founder of TSMC.
Yeah.
And one thing first of all, when they started TSMC, it was not apparent to everyone that that it would make sense to have a foundry like them, a foundry model. And the like foundry and like fabless, that was like not accepted as like the future. So it was just, I think that the founder of TSMC said was, there's just all of these really smart, silicon designers at Texas Instruments and various places. And if they could have a foundry to utilize to scale up their designs, it would enable all of them to maybe start businesses of their own. So that was like the insight that led them to start TSMC and the whole idea of it. And I think that one of the things that they felt, or the founder felt, was he thought it was essential to be really like customer friendly or customer focused, and that was their core. That would be core to their success, for them. So they're not always trying to extract as much value, let's say, out of the customer relationship, if they didn't think it was beneficial to like the industry or the broader sort of ecosystem. That came up recently in a TSMC, earnings call, where I think with the semiconductor shortage, there was analysts asking like, why haven't your prices gone up?
Yeah.
And they were expecting them to go up because, supply and demand would say that they should go up. And so I think like the markets had priced that in, but the leaders at TSMC had not really increased their pricing very much, or they weren't showing like gross margins increase. And their response was something simple like, we just think the prices are about right. And it was like, okay, that comes from sort of a value of like wanting to be customer centric and not necessarily trying to maximize your share price. And it's one of the reasons why like TSMC will probably be immovable as a force to be reckoned with in the world of semiconductors. And they're just such a important company in the world, is sort of that, they're thinking for the long run and not necessarily to, maximize the like quarterly gross margins.
Yeah.
So
Maximize
I think that, I really liked that. I felt that really resonated with me. I think what inspires us at Culture is like some similar values of, we see so much potential for engineering biology to produce different molecules that would make a huge impact in the world. And we just need to figure out how to build the tools and like really in a real way that really solves the problems. And if we actually contribute towards that mission, it will make an impact and in the long run. And I think, so we really care about how can we create our set of infrastructure and tools that are the most useful to the most sets of companies. That's really important to us. And that's how we've been, we've tried to develop the technology and the business model accordingly.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating dynamic, because you are essentially a bet on the industry in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. If this industry continues to grow, Culture is going to be in great shape, just like, semiconductors and TSMC, as computing continued to grow, they were a awesome go-to source for all sorts of companies who wanted to get started, who couldn't build semiconductors. Yeah. And that specialization on just building semiconductors means that today, 50 years later, no one can build semiconductors as well as they can because of that technical expertise they've just doubled down on over and over again.
Yeah. I think one thing I'd share there is like, I remember when I was a first year grad student and I was walking around Kendall Square in MIT. And I think like maybe 6 months before, the CRISPR papers had come out, and I was in this class with multiple grad students who were like in different labs that were trying to like come up with the first CRISPR paper. And I just remember being like, wow, the whole underlying technologies and like core science of biology are being figured out in real time. Like everything I learned in mechanical engineering in my engineering curriculum was like from like 100 years ago or like 50 years ago. So like this whole space of biology and bioengineering is totally dynamic and changing. And like if you took intro to bio like 20 years ago, it is like totally out of date to the knowledge today. So I think that like it's just a really fascinating time to be in the world of biotechnology from my perspective as like a business owner, which the opportunity is that like most of the discovery is yet to happen. Most of the innovation is yet to happen. So there's so much possibility, so many unexpected things that will happen, like a CRISPR discovery, that will just further push things along. And then, of course, you also have these other sort of meta trends, mega trends, like the technology advances and sequencing and synthesis, sort of enabling everything, that also make sort of the whole space sort of supercharged. And I think the other thing for me is just when I think about sort of when I think about how like just truly and utterly amazing biology is at like solving most of any problem, like biology has evolved these different sort of structures and molecules and proteins that can do so many amazing things, so many more things that are more important than humans have ever created. So I think that there's so much more potential for humans, people, scientists, to design new biomolecules to take what evolution has already developed and then put our like human design touch on it to create all these new things. There's just so much possibility there that is sort of untapped, that I think we're just at the very, very beginning of using biology to develop these like new molecules, new proteins, new things. I really just think we're at the beginning of it, biologically produced materials, sort of remaking most of the physical environment, physical and material supply chains. So, obviously I'm very bullish on all those things. But, I think we're at the very beginning stages of that.
No, it's a pretty amazing idea, combining, AI with synthetic biology plus the businesses on the back end to actually scale anything that synthetic biology might make, like Culture Bio is doing. It feels like another step in synthetic biology. You would consider this synbio, right?
Yeah. I mean, synthetic biology has long been a term that it's hard to pin down what exactly does that mean. I think the proponents of synthetic biology, I'm thinking, the folks in the, early 2000s at, MIT, who coined the term, they were thinking basically creating an engineering toolkit for biology, right? So that's what I normally think of as synthetic biology, but other people would just say bioengineering or genetic engineering or...
Yeah. A toolkit is pretty much everything in biotech these days is a toolkit in some way or another.
Yeah.
And it feels like the whole space is kind of moving in that direction.
Yeah. But like, I think when I think industries, like the synthetic biology industry, I think what people typically are thinking is like non-pharmaceutical uses of biological engineering. So, making new foods, new materials, things like that. When I talk about it, I usually just use the words like there's biopharmaceuticals, which is, you're doing synbio in order to make those biopharmaceuticals. Then there's agriculture biotechnology, of which there's a big component where you're designing new organisms like bacteria and fungi that are then put onto crops to improve their yields. And then you have sort of industrial biotechnology, which is sort of materials, foods, fragrances, specialty chemicals that, a lot of people call synthetic biology. But anyway.
We've talked a little bit about how this is very much a deep tech company and requires some real capital expenditures up front. You've raised $100 million to, it sounds like, not only build these bioreactors in the cloud, but actually build all of the machinery to do it from scratch. Can you tell us a little bit about raising that capital and kind of how the pitch works for investors? And yeah, we can go dive in from there.
Yeah, it's really interesting because for better or worse, we've always fundraised with like sales progress or like revenue progress or like customer interest. So we haven't raised all this money because we just told a really compelling big story about the future of our technology development and hoped that, we could build it and it would be useful. It's always been, here's our progress from a revenue perspective. Here's like real data. And, here's, of course, the technology we're developing too. So, and again, that's because early on, we built the first version, a super, super scoped down version of the vision, in like 12 months, 15 months from forming the company. And that's because Matt's my co-founder, we like had enough engineering skills ourselves to build the first version. Again, this like very de-scoped version of the product. So that's been sort of an interesting thing. So I think we're unlike maybe other deep tech companies, which are like, hey, we're not gonna generate revenue for 5 years, but here's the development path to building this breakthrough technology. So, or like maybe we have intellectual property from some academic group or whatever, and we're gonna use that as sort of like a barrier to entry, and we got to develop it for a few years. So we're pretty different in that way. And again, I say for better or worse because I think there could have been some benefits of being not worried about the revenue side for a few years and really focused on hardware and software development. But the way we did it is we ended up getting to market really fast and continuing to be very iterative with our development.
Yeah.
So, I think that each fundraise has had both a component of here's the real business progress, and here's the vision for what this company can become, and both are really essential to the storytelling. And so, there's definitely a lot of elements to our fundraising, which looks like probably like a SaaS business, where you're saying here's some metrics, here's looking at LTVs, or looking at our ACV, or looking at the gross margin, or et cetera, like this, a lot of the typical KPIs, that financial KPIs and metrics that a SaaS company would have. So that's an element of our fundraising process for sure. The other thing that's an element of our fundraising process is the whole capital cost equation. So thinking about payback periods for our capital equipment. Those are obvious questions to be asking. We often sort of show lots of good metrics around, okay, here's what it would cost if we built it with our technology. Here's what it looks like if you have to buy it from the hardware supply chain, hardware providers that exist, and like show huge differences in the payback period and the return on investment period. So that's another element to our fundraising process that we look at that. And then again, the whole, definitely talking about the vision of the business, where are we going? How does this fit within the broader ecosystem? How, the growth of the broader market, that also is a huge element to our, fundraising story as well.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect segue. My last question for everybody on the show is about your long-term vision for the company.
Sure.
And I think, especially in this one, it might also be interesting to talk about your long-term vision for kind of the whole biotech, bioengineering industry over the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Yeah, I'll talk about maybe that first, because that's fun. So I'll just go like vertical by vertical. So biopharma, we're already like in the S curve of adoption of like biomolecules for pharmaceuticals. We're like all the way in the midpoint already. So we're like continuing up the steep part of the S curve right now. And so in the next 10, 20, 30 years, there'll just continue to be more and more and more biologically produced therapeutics. So cell and gene therapies will become, very prominent, additional types of all different types of protein therapeutics past just monoclonal antibodies will become very prevalent. So there'll just be a continued diversity of different interesting and important biomolecules that are used for therapeutics. And so, again, steep part of that S curve just continues on. And what does that do, by the way? That's like helps solve, particularly things like gene therapies. Some of it is like cures for genetic diseases, or, new, really impactful cures for cancer. There's a ton of folks working on the whole cellular rejuvenation and anti-aging sets of ailments. So there's just I'm not the expert to tell you all about all the amazing sort of new therapeutics in the next 20 or 30 years, but that is just definitely going to continue, and we're in the midst of that sort of midway point of an S curve. So so then in the agricultural space, I'll use that, and I'm by no means no expert here, but this is just what I sort of see happening. So I think in general, we're in this new trajectory where modern agriculture is looking at ways to, bring back some of the important elements of like old types of agriculture, where we're not, totally, plowing all the soils, not bringing in nitrogen in the form of fertilizer, because we're seeing these huge issues that is modern agriculture causes. Whether it's bringing out the carbon out of the soil, because we've gotten rid of all the mycorrhizal networks that are typically in fertile soil, or we're just having to rely on nitrogen and these other chemicals instead of relying again on a complex ecosystem of microbes and fungi. So in general, we're seeing this movement in the agriculture sector to think about both on the operations side, like how do you actually run your agricultural operation to be less disruptive of that sort of local ecology of the soil. But then additionally, from a biotechnology perspective, we're seeing really interesting companies come out with these fungi and microbes to actually put back into the soil that can act as a fertilizer or act as a pesticide that can replace some of those chemicals, bring carbon back into the soil. So there's a lot of really big and small companies that are doing that. So like some of our customers who do that are like Pivot Bio, Join Bio, two really exciting companies in that space. So I think in the next 20 or 30 years, we're going to see that as a really huge development in agriculture. That just starts really transitioning some of those additives and processes. And then sort of in let's say the food space, food is probably one of the most exciting spaces in biomanufacturing because we're seeing incredible consumer demand. So just consumers are demanding alternatives to animals, and which is really exciting. We're seeing, more and more people are becoming vegan, but also more and more people are like, hey, if a burger tastes more like the real thing, I'm like more willing to go and eat an Impossible Burger or Beyond Burger, and I'll transition some of my meat eating to those things. I think we're just at the beginning, though. If you just think about like those two products I just mentioned, they're still only like a rough simulation of the real thing. So there's going to be a lot more innovation to make the Impossible Burgers and the Beyond Burgers of the world like taste really like meat. Like one example, for example, would be bringing in all the fats that are typically in meat that make it so, much like meat, right? Like those fats that you're maybe typically making an Impossible Burger from, I'm actually not sure where they're sourced from, but some plant-based source. But what if you could actually produce those animal fats using something like microbial fermentation and put it into the Impossible Burger? It would really give it that like fatty taste. So I think we're going to see much better versions of all, types of, the alt dairies, chickens, that are where you're getting these like superstar ingredients, like the heme protein from Impossible, but like lots more of those that are produced by biomanufacturing that allow the marketed adoption of those products to really start taking a bite out of the meat industry and the dairy industry. Another example would be a company like Perfect Day, right, that's making dairy proteins. And so they're putting that into cream cheeses and all sorts of different dairy products. So that I think is going to be a huge trend. The market assessments on the demands from microbial produced, the production needs for microbial produced proteins is really incredible. Like what the projections are, the projections are so big just for that sector that the amount of global biomanufacturing capacity we need to increase by on the order of 10 to 100x in this decade to supply the demand that people are projecting, which, by the way, is probably the thing that will keep it from hitting that projection is the manufacturing capacity. It's part of what we're trying to do to help solve that problem.
And you're fundamentally building for that to expand that bottleneck.
Yes, that is, yeah, exactly. That seems like the core bottleneck from my perspective, at least, because there's so much consumer demand. The other thing in the food space to keep your eye on this next 20 to 30 years that is very much like, it's very hot in the sort of investment marketplace is cultured meat. And cultured meat's really fascinating, obviously, using bioreactors to culture cells, turn that directly into meat. It is much more difficult than the Beyond Burgers and Impossible Burgers in terms of the technical development. It's much more difficult to get to the price points that are acceptable. But, you are creating meat directly. And so, ostensibly, it should really be able to recreate a lot of the mouthfeel and texture and taste of real meat. So I think this next 4 or 5 years are going to be super interesting because you've seen these companies in the cultured meat space raise hundreds of millions of dollars on a lot of promise. And I think we're going to see are we at the top of this hype cycle, or is this actually, what's happening in cultured meat is going to be really interesting. My personal opinion is that I think cultured meat will eventually one day be something that is broadly produced, but it's going to take more time than probably people are expecting because of the huge difficulties of scale up and the costs associated with it. So I would think in this next, until 2030, we're getting small amounts of cultured meat at high price points, maybe some in like a lot of restaurants, things like that. But broad, I think it's going to take a lot longer for a cultured meat company to have the same impact that like Impossible has today. Like it's going to take several more years, if not to the end of this decade, before something like that is possible based on the price point. It's my guess, at least. Hope to be proven wrong there, but that's sort of my best perspective. I could keep going on in other verticals. I think there's a lot of fascinating things happening in the materials space, particularly with mycelium-based materials. There's a whole wave of companies making cannabis molecules like CBD and THC in fermentation, where that seems like it is very logical that it will supplant cannabis production. There's a lot of other interesting areas that I could talk about, but I also, I can tell you also the culture's vision in terms of how we'll be a part of all this. But obviously, I'm super pumped and excited about all these different spaces. I think there's a tremendous amount of development happening, and there's a lot of promise in all of these different areas.
Yeah, I keep hearing about mycelium. I'm going to have to dig into that, have a company that's working on that on the show. But yeah, I mean, I think all of that fits perfectly into culture and kind of paints the bull case for what you're building, because if all of this takes off, they'll need bioreactors to build any and all of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you want to touch on Culture's vision, or I think that's
I touched on it earlier, but our vision is to be the infrastructure from small scale to large scale that all these companies use to develop, scale up, manufacture their products. So that really is the vision. It's going to take us a while to get there, particularly the commercial manufacturing side. Where right now we have small scale infrastructure that we operate hundreds of reactors that customers are currently utilizing in a subscription model. We're building out pilot scale reactors right now so that we add that to the infrastructure. Pilot scale is hundreds of liters that allow you to manufacture some of your product. But the vision is to bring that into tens of thousands of liters in terms of the scale, and then run many reactors in parallel in order to do manufacturing. We see really interesting opportunities. Similar to how at a small scale, we've built our reactors in a really low cost way and we can build them fast. We have a technical approach and a vision towards building, these tens of thousands of liter scale reactors also at a much cheaper price point and a much faster way than traditional systems. So that's where we'll be heading towards in the next few years, is on a technical and R&D level, while we continue to operate our small scale and pilot scale services.
It sounds like an awesome business. And Thanks so much for coming on the show. This has been great to dive into it. And every time I talk to someone in the space, I learn a little bit more about how biotech and this whole industry works. So I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was really fun. And yeah, if anyone is interested in learning more who's a listener, feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm will@culturebiosciences.com. And I, always appreciate hearing from folks. So thanks, Joe, for having me on.
Cool.